Hello everyone. Welcome to Livestock Malaysia webinar titled Factors Affecting Hatch Window. My name is Hani. Before we start, I would like to mention some housekeeping rules for this webinar. All microphone and video of attendees have been muted. If you have any question to ask our speaker, do list them down at the Q&A box. We will have a Q&A session after the speaker has presented. If there's any internet disruption during this webinar, please be patient and try to sign in again. Without further ado, I'll hand over the floor to our moderator, Dr. Nick Muhammad Faiz bin Muhammad Azmi, the Vice President of WVPA, for the welcome remarks. Dr. Nick, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you to the MC. Okay, good afternoon or good morning or good night, depends on where you are online from, because I saw that from the participant list or registration list, we have quite a number of participants from outside Malaysia, which some are from USA, Vietnam, Australia, or others. Okay, I hope you are safe and healthy during these trying times, during this pandemic times, or wherever you are. Okay, this is our first webinar co-organized by WVPA Malaysia and Livestock Malaysia. We will try to we try to organize this kind of webinar on monthly basis. This will be our first webinar for this year, and then I hope you will enjoy today's webinar. And before I proceed further, I would like to introduce our speakers today, which is Mr. Jason Cormick. Okay, Jason's career has spent over 30 years in poultry industry, working in over 55 countries around the world in everything from pedigree to broilers and layers. He is passionate about hatchery operations and in optimizing chick quality, previously having covered various areas such as production, biosecurity, quality assurance, animal welfare, and project management. Jason uses his acquired knowledge to produce and give the best and the most entertaining poultry training in the industry. Currently, he is based in Malaysia, working with Aviagen, supporting clients both locally and remotely around the world to improve their results and supplying training materials for webinars and seminars. Okay, and our talk today, our first webinar today, will be about factors affecting hatch window. As you may know, that hatch window has a huge impact on the performance and bottom line of your operations. Here we go through the journey from a single cell to a newly hatched chick, and then we review all the relative factors that can influence the spread from first chick to hatch to the last. Without further ado, I would like to welcome our speaker today, Mr. Jason Cormick. Please welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will start sharing my screen. Okay. I think we're good to go.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Right. Okay. Before I start, obviously I've been in the industry for quite a while now, and I like to collect things. And one of these, what you see here is a postcard. It's actually a German postcard, but it really depicts quite nicely what is the hatch window. You know, why are we worried about it? Because it is a race, and it's in nature when the mother hen is going to hatch chicks. She needs to make sure they all hatch together, so she can take them off for food and water. And hatch window is trying to reduce that amount because commercially we have thousands of eggs. So it's longer than it would be in nature, generally speaking, but there's a lot we can do to minimize that. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So first of all, what is a hatch window? Because there's a number of definitions. In my opinion, and it doesn't make it right, but a lot of people would talk about the sort of first chick to a percentage of chicks hatched. For me, it's the first chick that hatches to the last one that hatches. That's quite important that we understand. It's the whole range of birds that are hatching. So and why is hatch window important? Well, if we're not taking care of hatch window, the first ones that hatch as soon as they externally pip, they're going to start externally breathing. So they're not using the chorioallantois anymore, which is quite good in reducing moisture loss. But because they're now externally breathing through normally through their nostrils, if they're comfortable, they're still going to lose a higher amount of moisture loss. And this is going to cause us a problem if we then have a long wait until we get to the farm. Now, during this presentation, I'll also ask, it's just four questions essentially. And I'd appreciate if you could really give us as much feedback as you can, because it's going to be quite useful for us going forward. So, first of all, this is the first question. Uh, that is, what is your typical hatch window you're seeing from your multi-stage incubators? And the next one is the same, but essentially it's your single stage incubators. So yeah, if you could do me a huge favor here and just type in what you're seeing if you've got multi-stage and if you've got single stage, or both if you have those both. And yeah, that really gives us a good indication later of because some of the other questions which will come up will relate to this and how long we have between that first bird hatching and delivery to the farm, for example. That's what we'd like to know. Okay. So the first one is mainly 30 to 36. Yeah, that's multi-stage, so it's understandable. And yeah, single stage being much tighter. And we'll go into explain more of why that is as we go through the presentation. Okay, yeah, as was already mentioned, when we look at factors that are causing the hatch window, we need to go back to the very start of uh, development. So from a single cell, and we need to look at what's going on from that single cell all the way through to the chick. So to do that, let's first go and look inside the hen. So if we go inside the hen, she's going to release an ovum. It will be fertilized, and from this point on, it will start to replicate. But because at the beginning it's just doubling in size, so from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8, etc., it's quite a slow process. By the time it gets to the shell gland, and it's this when it will be pushed into that egg kind of shape, the mammillary cone will be put down, the cuticle will be put down on top of that. But all this time, those cells are still replicating. So you've got anywhere between 60 to 80,000 cells, typically by the time you get to the cold store. But this can range quite a bit more. And we're going to talk about some of those ranges as well. Now, I'm not sure how many of you know about the different stages of during development. But we're just going to talk firstly about these, basically the first four. Now, when you get to your cold store, you might have a 9.5 if it's a particularly young flock and it's winter time, or it can go right up to a 13, but more likely you're going to get around a 10 to 11 stage. But these can really vary depending on a number of factors. Firstly, the chick itself, so the hen itself, the temperature of the hen, how long she holds that egg in, the kind of nest boxes, which we'll get round to. Also, how well are you insulating your trucks? So when you take your truck from a cold room to the hatchery, are the eggs on the outside, are they warming up? And then, of course, how you're going to pre-warm those eggs as well. Just for completeness sake, when we get when we start to incubate those eggs, there's a lot more stages, which we're not going to worry about here today. But just so you have the information, there's a lot goes on to make that chick from a single cell all the way to that newly hatched chick. But these different stages, you can think of it in terms of a journey. So if you look at it as a train journey, for example, and along that train journey, there's stations. Now here, they're all equally spaced, which in reality that's not true, because bearing in mind these stages are decided by a human who's looking for a difference. But this rate of journey as it goes along, we can speed it up, and we speed it up by increasing the temperature, but also we can cool it down. So we can slow it down by decreasing the temperature. So we have that option, and these actually are what's going to make difference to your hatch window. So you've got to remember it's from the very point of the first cell all the way through. So let's talk about that first cell when the egg is laid. So by then we've got anywhere between 30,000 to 60,000 cells. But if you've got manual nest boxes, for example, every time another hen goes and sits on top of that egg, it's going to push that um, germ that little bit further. So it's going to replicate more cells. So if you've got a manual nest box and you've got 4 eggs in there, for example, the first one that laid is going to be more advanced than the last one that was laid. In comparison, if you've got automatic nest boxes, those eggs are just going to roll away from the hens and they're going to cool at a similar rate. So you'll see that automatic nest boxes, generally speaking, you're going to get a tighter hatch window because you don't have that variance. This brings me on to our second question, which is what is the percentage of manual? It's just covered my screen. Manual versus automatic nest boxes do you have on your farm? So are you all manual, basically 100% and zero automatic? Are you 25%? So you've got a few to 75. Is it 50-50? Or is it zero and you're all automatic? So if you can just, if you're not sure, just give me what your sort of educated guess from your operation. Doesn't have to be exact. Just this will relate with the other questions that come up as to why we're seeing that wider hatch window. Okay, so the majority of you are all on manual nest boxes, which today I'm quite surprised, to be honest. But probably typical of the region more than global at the moment. But very interesting because that tells me a lot. So I appreciate you getting involved and answering that one. Okay. Now, the other thing that's going to make the difference between how far that germ develops is the size of the egg. So on the left-hand side, you'll see there's a small egg, and on the right-hand side, a large egg. The small egg is going to have a greater surface area to mass. So once those eggs have been laid, they're going to start to cool down. And you have to bear in mind that as those eggs cool down, it's only when the germ goes below the physiological zero that development stops. So you'll see here the small egg will cool much quicker. So you will see generally on a young flock, it's not going to be such an advanced embryo development stage than you would see on an older flock. So you've got farm factors that are going to influence it. Like I said before, you've also got the transportation. So when those eggs come to the farm, if, for example, you're in a hot country, which I'm guessing most of you are, if you're not insulated, those eggs are going to warm up from the outside in. So you'll see that the eggs particularly from the back of the truck and on the sides of the truck, if that's left sitting in the sun, they're going to start warming. So they're going to develop a little bit further. Of course, then we've got a lot of factors in the hatchery that are going to have that, make that difference. And we're going to address some of those as well. But on the farm, again, it depends also what are you going to collect those eggs on? So if you pick them up on plastic flats or the carton trays, that's also going to make a difference because the plastic flats are going to have a lot of airflow across. So you'll see that those eggs are going to cool much quicker and they're going to cool more uniformly. Whereas if you put them onto carton trays and they haven't cooled yet, what you'll see is those ones in the middle will retain the heat. So those ones are going to develop further than the ones on the outside. An example, so this was an operation, and I have to say, was everything was really quite nice. You'll see here they are measuring the temperature at the eggshell. So we want to know what the temperature at the eggs is rather than what's going on in the wall. So that's very good. Unfortunately, they had two different temperatures in that room. So when I looked here, we saw that there was each one of those chiller units was set at a different temperature. Now, why is that important? Because if you start to warm up with still air, for example, you don't have any airflow, you're really going to struggle to get rid of that difference. So this was several hours after, but you see there's still that 2-degree difference between the one side of the room and the other. And that means that some eggs are already developing quicker than others. Now, something, and we'll ask about your sort of whether you're, you know, particularly if you're multi-stage, people will tend to bring eggs out and put them in front of the machines. There's something you need to understand that the way eggs warm up. So if you do that, you bring the eggs out into front of the trolleys. They're going to warm up in this way. So they basically follow Newton's law. Um, so it's going to be very quick at first, but it's going to slow right down the closer they get. Now, they're also going to warm up from the outside in. So the center of the trolleys is going to be the last ones to warm up. You can really improve this by a large capacity fan, but run it at a slow speed, bounce it off a wall, and so the air moves gently through the eggs. And you'll see that this will warm, the eggs will start to warm much uniformly, much more uniform, because otherwise you're going to get some development or they're going to be ready to go on the outside of the trolleys sooner than they are in the middle of the trolleys. So you always need some airflow if you're trying to warm eggs up or cool eggs down. This is just Newton's law. So what happens when we've got old eggs? So for example, these are all stage 11. Now, the older you keep your eggs, you're going to get some cellular deterioration, so some cellular mortality. If you look here, this would be where the cells are dying. So when you start to warm those eggs up, these germs here will need to replace these cells before they can continue. So essentially, what you'll have is you'll have embryonic germs at different points. So they need to go further along the race, if you like. So the one with the more mortality or the cellular mortality is going to be further back in the race than the one with the least. So you'll see this is going to make your hatch window get wider and wider. Something else I need to explain so we're quite clear about this is how well the embryo will develop. And the ideal temperature, the eggshell temperature for the embryo to develop is 100 degrees. Now, if we go above that, we're going to start to speed it up. So we'll accelerate that. If we go below it, we're going to reduce it. But there's a switch over. Basically, when the chick becomes ectodermic, you're going to see a slight difference. So you're going to get accelerated growth as such. So you're going to speed up that incubation process, but actually the bird's not going to develop like it should. So let me explain a little bit. So when we take our egg from the cold store, first of all, essentially it's asleep. So it's in stasis. It's not doing anything. Um, so when we put it into a higher temperature, we're going to wake it up. Now, at 98 degrees, degrees eggshell temperature, it will develop, but it's going to develop quite slowly. So it's going to take you longer than your 504 hours to incubate this one. If we warm it up um, degrees incubation time, it's also going to give you a very nice way of developing that chick. So it's going to be the strongest chick that you can do it. And temperature is the most critical of all the parameters. So this is really really worth sort of, right. If we go up a little bit in temperature and the thermic age earlier, we're going to have incubation time that needs. But that's more so in the early stages. Once it starts producing heat, what you're going to see is you're going to see this retardation of the development. So if we've got two um, embryos of exactly the same stage, but incubated in hatches where the eggshell temperature will be slightly higher, you'll see this one with a higher temperature will not absorb this yolk as well. It's not utilizing it. So you're going to get a smaller chick with a bigger yolk. And typically you'll see those black navels. So this is broiler chicks. I have to, because there is another way of getting black navels. Um, so yeah, what you high temperatures early on, you're going to accelerate that growth. High temperatures later on, you're going to retard the development of that bird. So you end up with a smaller bird, larger yolk sac. But if you look at it like this, and this is particularly relevant if you running multi-stage, for example, or you've got a machine with hot and cold spots, because what you're going to see here, and this is why when we go in and measure, we're always looking at the equator of the egg, because that's where the embryonic germ is, that we're going to be looking, yeah. So here, when we got those different temperatures, you see why the hatch window becomes so wide. Now, if you look at um, chronological age, so how long it took to get there, these will all be the same. So, and this is particularly important if you ever do in novo vaccination, for example, because this will can really uh, mess up your vaccination program. So, although they're all the same chronological age, their biological age is different. And it's important that we understand that because it's good. That's what's making the difference with our hatch window. So this will, the one that's running higher will finish before 504 hours. The one uh, running at ideal temperature, eggshell temperature of 100 will be 504 or thereabouts. There's always a little bit of fluctuation. And the slower one is always going to take longer. Now, if we look at what goes on in wild birds, and you'll see this depending on also who takes care of the young. Now, if you look, you've got eagles here, you've got owls. You'll see the penguin there. Now, I think everybody can remember that penguins is genuinely the male that will take care of the young, but they'll have this brooding patch, and the feathers will drop out when they go into lay, or for us, it's into production. The chicken is the same. The feathers will drop out. Underneath, there'll be a bunch of blood vessels, and that's so she can measure the temperature of the eggs. And in this way, she can see, make sure that the eggs are comfortable or not. So here you can see that actual process going on. You'll see what she's doing is rolling them over to make sure they're the same temperature all around. And that's why if you go in and check your machine, you want to go in and check around the equator, because that embryonic germ is going to be sitting there. See, she's quite attentive. Yeah, if we look at what is our optimum incubation temperature, if you're talking about eggshell temperature, that's very easy. It's 100. But if you're talking about air temperature, then that really depends on what you're going to be incubating. So different lines, different. Obviously, first of all, different strains, whether it's a broiler or a layer, is going to make a huge difference. But even if it's a layer of the same breed, a broiler of the same breed, if it's a slow or a fast growing, that's going to make a difference. The sexual dimorphism of those birds is going to make a difference. Of course, whether you've got young and old flocks, large eggs are going to produce more heat. But what you're going to find generally as a flock gets older, your fertility is going to drop. So you'll see there's this broad range of temperatures or heat production from your eggs. Now, if you don't know what that is, it's very hard to then just run on the air temperature. So you need to know what your eggshell temperature is. If we look as an embryo develops, first of all, it's going to be the same temperature as the environment that it's in. But once it starts producing heat, then you need to lower that temperature. So, and that's going to be determined on how much heat it produces. So, a fast growing strain, for example, is going to produce a bit more heat, or an older flock, like a larger egg, is going to produce more heat. So, your ambient heat, your air temperatures have to come down a little bit more, and vice versa. If you've got a flock that doesn't produce as much heat, you're going to need a higher temperature for your air temperature. Just something that happens, I noticed quite a lot, is when people don't fill the machines fully. And I've seen this actually where people will buy machines larger capacity than they want. This can be quite dangerous because the incubator is designed to warm up that mass of eggs. So if you only fill it part full, you're going to have too much heating, and then it's going to overshoot. So the cooling will come on, which will be too much. And what you'll see is your incubator will start bouncing, too hot, too cold, too hot, too cold. When you get that, you're really messing up with the speed of the development, but also the signals. So you'll see a lot more malformations, that kind of thing. So something you want to watch. If you ever go down below 50% in your incubators, you've got to be really careful how you're going to load those machines, um, and watch to make sure we don't get that bouncing around. Now, if we go back, I don't go back this far, but uh, basically when we started with incubation, it was a single temperature, ventilation, humidity throughout the whole process, but much smaller numbers. When I started in the industry, this is the machines I had. So you'll see they're fixed rack machines. What I will say, fixed rack are, of course, awful for biosecurity. In fact, biosecurity is non-existent. But for the way the heat is balanced, they're actually quite good. So you could get quite a good hatch out of these. But fortunately, not many. There's still some around, but fortunately, not too many of those anymore. And then we went to single stage. Sorry, yeah. Sorry, this is still a multi-stage. So, yeah, basically they would put the eggs in. So fresh eggs would go into the machine, and then they'd be moved to another part of the machine. And so you'd have eggs of all different development stages um, in the same machine. But of course, you can only set for one temperature. And so it basically means that your fresh eggs that go in there are going to be too cold, and your eggs that from a later stage are going to be too hot. So it's really not the ideal. And you'll see the same thing with the corridor machines. So you can only have one temperature in there. So it's never going to be ideal. Of course, then single stage come along, and this was a huge advantage in terms of hatch window. Because we could stagger that. So at the beginning, we could go quite high in temperature and just bring it down as is dictated by the embryos. Now, something I mentioned earlier on, that this is how much you can speed up incubation at the beginning, and particularly in the first 4 days. So essentially, they have to adhere to the Van Hoff rule. So Van Hoff was a Dutch physicist, and it's very simple. The easiest way to explain this is the more you warm something up, the quicker the reaction. Now, um, why is this important for incubation? Because during the first 4 days, that embryo is biochemical in nature. So the more you play with the temperature here, the more you can affect the final incubation time. As it becomes more biomechanical, that effect is reduced somewhat. Let's look at the impact that uniformity can have as well. And I'm particularly talking about when you have these small eggs that you see here in amongst the larger ones. Uh, we see this quite a bit. If you've got flocks that are doing this, remove the small ones and incubate them separately. If you can make several trays of them, you're going to have a much easier time of it. What happens in this situation when you have like here? So imagine those smaller eggs that you have here. They're going to get up to incubation temperature first before these because these are going to take a little bit longer. Now, as time goes on and the eggs start producing the heat, as they get closer to when they're going to actually be hatching, what normally happens is the smaller eggs that are surrounded by other small eggs have less heat being produced. But because they're next to the larger ones, they get forced on. So they're the ones that are going to hatch out first in your hatcher baskets. And of course, as soon as they do that, they start externally breathing, so losing condition. And what you'll see from that is a small egg producing a small chick, losing condition first before the rest of them. So you'll see these smaller birds in your hatcher baskets. So much better if you can separate those smaller eggs and hatch those separately. Other things, I have to say, I haven't seen this an awful lot. This is probably the extreme, but a client was incubating broilers and layers in the same machine. Now, this particular incubator is controlled from eggshell temperature. So if you're going to control it from the amount of heat that a broiler produces, that means those layers are going to really be quite late in coming off. Um, Besides that, from a biosecurity point of view, you should never do that. But just as an example, even if you've got two different strains, you don't really want to be doing that. You don't want a fast growing and a slow growing strain in the same machine. They've got different requirements. So you need to really make sure that those machines are loaded with similar flocks at least. Other things that are going to change how fast or slow the development of those embryos is one is where is your fan in the machine? So they can be in the middle, they can be on the side walls. The velocity can change, so it can be fast or slow. The angle of the trays also affects the temperature of the eggs. So you need to consider that as well. Particularly if you go with a reduced angle on the tray, you have to speed up the velocity of the air. So yeah, different positions, different temperatures of the egg. Also, where are you taking that reading from? So depending on where your probe is going to have, it's going to have a different reading in that machine. Also, where are your cooling coils? Where are your heating elements? All these things are going to make a difference. And of course, not just that, but what you're actually incubating. So you're going to have eggs with different requirements as well. So to go in and measure eggshell temperature is quite a useful thing for you to do. Yeah, when we get to the hatcher baskets, it becomes even more complicated because as soon as they start hatching, they start disturbing the airflow. But today we're going to leave that one. Something that I see quite a bit with the larger new hatcheries. And that's essentially when we build a hatchery, we'll have one supply for the water, which will run along each of the settler runs. And we'll also have a supply of air coming in, which will be teed off to each room. Now, what can happen when we have this, people will start loading the machines and they'll load them from one side and what we refer to as snaking. So they'll load one room at a time. This is really very dangerous because what happens when all those machines are producing heat, they're all asking for cooling and they're all asking for air at the same time. Now, majority of suppliers are not going to have that much water going through their system to supply all the machines in a single room to cool at the same time. So normally it's about 50%. So if you have a new machine or if you're running your hatchery with several setter rooms and you're loading like this, I would look at when you have a slower time, the possibility of changing it a little bit. Essentially, what you want to do is load it in a staggered fashion. That means that when they're producing heat or asking for air, they're asking for the air and the cooling water from all over the system. This takes a lot of pressure off your cooling systems. Other things that are going to affect your cooling, of course, normally we measure the chiller water, and not many people are measuring the water as it goes into the machine. So if we look, um, if we don't insulate that pipe work properly, the temperature at the chiller and the temperature at the incubator are going to be different. So we need to make sure we lag it correctly. Other things that are going to affect that we've seen are if you don't have the correct pressure. So if you don't have enough water pushing through the system, for example, by the time that water reaches the incubator, it's taking longer, so it's going to be higher in temperature. So make sure normally it's around 3 to 4 bar, but it depends on what system you're using. But something to watch for. Other things that will make a difference, for example, if you know how a solenoid will work, when you want cooling water, the cooling to come on, if you've got soiled water, dirt in the water, for example, it can come in and it can stop the solenoid from closing again. So if your uh, cooling coils still have cold water running through them, that's going to slow down your development of the chicks. So if you've got two hatches, for example, one with this problem, you're going to expect them to hatch later on than the other hatcher. Other issues you might see are soiled pipes. So if you've got particularly dirty water, so this is an example. This water is coming directly from the setters. So this water is actually running through the cooling coils of the setters. And if you can imagine, that's not very efficient cooling. So you'd imagine this machines will be running hotter than they really should. And you'll see that the cooling will be left on much more than it typically would be. If you see this kind of build-up, basically your water is too alkaline. You've got a lot of build-up. This one was basically because they were taken from a borehole and it hadn't been filtered. Uh, I'm glad to say that that's been rectified since. But also machines don't just cool from water. They also use air to cool. And in this example, uh, the results from one machine were worse than another. And you will see, if you look at the air intake and the air supply, you'll see that there's quite a bit of difference. Now, normally that shouldn't make that big a deal, but if you put it under an infrared camera, you will see that the air air coming in from here in there is much cooler. So that's going to have, when you ventilate on this machine, it's going to have a greater cooling effect than the one next door to it. So you'll see if you've got that and the machines are set up exactly the same um, uh, profiles, then one's going to be reacting differently. So you'd imagine that the machine on the right hand side is going to run a little bit hotter than the one on the left, which will give you an earlier hatch, of course. This kind of solution, it's quite easy. Just flip those two. This is an overpressure grill. So this is just to take surplus air into the room. So we could move it across and take the air also from here. Other things, if you see when you're cleaned your machine and you see this dripping like this, now if it's dripping when the system isn't running, you can imagine that when it's under pressure, it's going to squirt out a little bit. Um, Similarly, if you see uh, this green residue on the pipes, this is because your water's too acidic. So you need to do something with that. Um, but also you will start to eat through these pipes quite aggressively. Other things now, if you've got a belt drive machine, for example, 100% of the motor speed is going to give you 100% of your RPMs, which is great while that's working. But if your belt starts to slip or your motor runs slow, then that's going to slip across and your blade will spin at a reduced rate. So you're not going to get the airflow around the machine that you really need. So your cooling is going to be affected. And if your cooling's affected, that means that your development rate's going to increase. Okay. Yeah. And if you have a multi-stage, for example, and the corridor machines like this, you know the airflow typically comes down from the motors above and then round on the top. Now, if you have a fan that stops like this one here, thing is, it you won't see it stop because the airflow in the machine will still make it look like it's turning, but it will be at a much reduced rate. So the eggs that are producing the most amount of heat are really going to start to suffer because they're not getting the cooling they want. Now, these would be from the same hatch, basically, but you could imagine these ones are going to be further forward than these ones. So, again, anything to do with airflow, cooling is going to affect your hatch window. Also, when you warming the eggs up, so depending on what machine, you need to make sure that your heater elements are working at the correct rates. So they're drawing the right amount of power. It's not just good enough to say they're getting hot because some might be faulty, some might be completely broken, but you need to check them. So you need to put a meter on them, see how much power they're actually drawing. Other things, so this is particularly if you have, and we see this, if you're struggling to cool the machine, and particularly in hatches, we see this. People will push up the air pressure in the front of the machine. But this has quite a negative effect. So if you've got too much air pressure in front of a hatcher like this, basically what it does is forces the air through the machine. And you will see this uh, tunnel of cold air pushing through. That means that any of the chicks here, the embryos here, are going to be later than what you'll see in this area. And it's quite typical that you'll see some dizzy chicks and the far corners of these. Also here at the bottom, depending on what machine you're using. But too much air pressure in front of the machine could cause that machine to tunnel, and then you're going to end up with a wider hatch window. So question 3, And this is just asking what is your average chick yield? So move that to there for a second. So if you've got 100% of your egg weight, how many percent is your chick? And your possible answers are less than or equal to 66%, 67 to 68%, 69 or greater percent, or D, I haven't got a clue, which I'd be surprised if you guys are honest, there'll be a few of you that you would never have measured actual chick yield, which is an interesting thing to do. But this tells us a lot about how long has the chick been sitting in the machine, and of course your moisture loss. So 67 to 68. So most of you, well, yeah, 57% is quite good. That's perfect. If you're getting that, that's ideal. And 13% of you were honest, which is cool too. That's great. Okay. Yeah, this is something else. When we talk about hatch window, and I really have to stress this a lot, and that is the observer effect. So if you're going in and measuring hatch window, and now typically that's done uh, by going in at different periods of time. So you might do it at every 6 hours or every 12 hours, take the birds out and measure how or count how many chicks have hatched, put those birds back in, close the machine back up. But there are two hatching triggers essentially. One is temperature, and the other one is reduction in oxygen. So both of those things will induce the hatch. Every time you go into a hatcher and you're going to increase the amount of oxygen and you're going to drop the temperature, which actually delays the hatch. So it's going to delay the next ones to come out. Now, I did a lot, you'll see here. Now, I think this was from 2003, if I'm not mistaken. I've done a lot of hatch window investigations and always found them to be wider than we'd want them to be. And to be perfectly honest, I believe it's because we was forcing them to be later or forcing them to take longer than they should be by going in, actively going in and looking and measuring it. And so just the act of doing it gives you, it messes up your data. So it's not a good thing to do to physically go in and start removing chicks because you're messing up what is would normally happen. Now, with that in mind, I visited a client and I thought, I'd be honest, I thought this was an excellent idea. Um, a quick way of counting how many chicks were there, and so you're not disturbing the machine too much. However, if you look under thermal imaging camera, you'll see that the frame is actually much colder than the surroundings, which is going to slow down the development of those eggs. Maybe not by much, but enough to sort of invalidate the results. So whatever you do, you need to make sure it's representative of what really is happening. So if we look at how can we measure hatch window, well, basically, when that first chick hatches out, you're going to start seeing the humidity rise because they're going to come out, they're going to be wet. That um, humidity has to go somewhere. So it goes into the atmosphere and then they'll start to hatch out. And then once they've all hatched out, you'll see that humidity start coming down again. And that's because you're not getting more chicks into the environment. So it's pretty safe to say that this is essentially your hatch window when you see that. So if you see your humidity peak on the machine, when you see it coming up and start to come back down again, you can say, okay, well, that's how long that batch of birds took to hatch. With good management, with single stage incubation, 24 to 26 hours is very achievable. Um, If you've got multi-stage, sort of 30 hours plus is going to be typical. But there's still a lot we can do to reduce that. Now, question 4, and this is, what is time is your shortest and longest delivery locations? So if we look, is it so for your shortest time, is it between 30 minutes to 4 hours, 4 hours to 12 hours, 12 to 24 hours, greater than 24 hours? And for your longest delivery locations, the same. Is it still relatively short, or can it be quite long? Because this tells us, I mean, basically from the first chick that hatched, how long it takes to actually get onto the farm. So, okay, that should have been 2 questions. Sorry, I think I possibly messed up the moderator, because that should be 2 questions. So I wanted to know what is your shortest and what is your longest. Um, okay, no problem. But generally speaking, most are under 12 hours, or within 12 to 24. Not many is going over 24 hours. So that's pretty good. So, yeah, just to conclude, so hatch window starts in the farm. Most people, when they talk about hatch window, will talk about cold spots, hot spots. That's absolutely true. That makes a big difference. But it actually starts on the farm, and how far do those germs develop, and how uniform is that development? And you can affect it throughout the whole operation. So as we go through, everything we do is going to affect that hatch window. If we've got um, bigger drift in the machine between warm and cold, that's going to spread everything apart, but also between different machines. So if you've got one incubator or hatcher that's running at slightly different temperatures to another one, you're still going to be pulling those birds out on the same day. So we need to make sure that even from machine to machine, everything is the same. And yeah, this is the key one, that basically once it's been widened, once we've pushed that hatch window apart, we can't undo that. So there's not, yeah, there's no silver bullet or magic wand to fix that. Basically, whatever we do with a wider hatch window, those first birds that are going to hatch, they're going to be the ones that struggle. Okay, so thank you for watching, and I will. I think we have a Q&A session, as I understand.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jason. Very interesting talk and presentation. I learned quite a lot of things today, actually. Okay. We have quite a number of questions from the audience. Let me go through a glance of some of the question. Okay. There's question number 1. Dr. Muhammad Azam from Saudi Arabia. He was asking, how does the egg sweating affect hatch window?
Okay, that's a very good one, actually. Yeah, if you've got egg sweating, so firstly, I'm going to tell you that they don't sweat. It's not sweating; it's condensation. And the real problem with that condensation is when you bring those eggs out, it's the moisture in the environment that hits the cold surface, and you'll see that on the top there. I always explain it like if you take a cold can of Coke out of the fridge and you see that condensation on the side, it's not coming from inside, so it's not sweating. It's actual condensation, and the problem with that is basically if you take the back of your hand and you lick the back of your hand and blow on it, that's what you're doing with the eggs. So when you're trying to warm those eggs up, you're actually cooling them down from evaporative loss, water, moisture loss, So you've got an evaporative cooling effect across. So you're trying to warm the eggs up, but you're cooling them down at the same time, and then they're going to suck in any bacteria on the outside. So you are going to affect the hatch window because it's going to take them longer to warm up. So you really want to avoid that condensation on the eggs at all costs. Really, it's just a matter of bringing them up gradually
Mhm.
so that you don't get that condensation. But it will affect hatch window because you're going to cool those eggs as you're trying to warm them up. And so it just takes longer to warm the eggs up.
Okay, great. We have another question from Dr. Hassan Sadeghi from Iran. He was asking if fluctuation of temperature during setter period and increasing temperature during hatcher period affects the hatch window.
Yes, yeah. Any change in temperature is going to affect it. Now, if you have fluctuation temperature at the beginning of incubation, so those first 4 days, for example, if you fluctuate at that point, you're not only going to affect hatch window because it's much more susceptible at that point, you're going to get a lot more malformations as well. And you'll see that particularly in multi-stage when you have eggs that have just warmed up and you bring in cold eggs and put them next to them,
Mhm.
that temperature will drop and then it will come back up again. And you'll see a lot more of the four-legged birds and that sort of thing, a lot more malformation going on. Um, but of course, because it's temperature related, you'll change that hatch window. And the other one was, yeah, if you have a temperature, hatcher temperature too high, you're going to force those chicks out. So you're going to, you'll get a tighter hatch window as it was. They'll hatch sooner. But because of that high temperature, they're not going to utilize the yolk sac like they should be. So they'll come out, but quite often you'll see the bloody beaks. You'll see the red hocks as well. And you'll see those black button navels.
Yep.
So not a good quality chick.
I agree with you on that. Okay, we have another question from an anonymous attendee. Okay, what is the incubation temperature? This is quite specific. What is the incubation temperature and eggshell temperature for slow growth chicken?
It's all the eggshell temperature is 100.
Mhm.
So that's very, very easy actually. In terms of what air temperature you want, really depends on what machine you're running and how that affects. So how much heat production is going from that slow growing bird. So you'll need higher air temperature than you would like a typical broiler bird or a fast growing bird. Uh, but in terms of what is that actual temperature, depends on what machine you're running, depends on how it's running. You know, although there's a lot of different factors, the only way you can tell is go in and actually measure that eggshell temperature.
Okay, I have another question which I want to ask myself, but it's also being asked by one of the attendees because probably it did not happen in Malaysia because in Malaysia we don't really practice in ovo vaccination. Okay,
Yep.
but in other countries we do. Okay, how does in ovo vaccination affect the hatch window and chick yields?
Yeah, it doesn't affect your hatch window, but what you're going to do is if you're doing an ovo and you have a wide hatch window, because when you vaccinate the birds, they have to be around 18 days, 18 and a half biological days. Um, so if you've got a wide hatch window, biologically, so you're going to have some embryos that aren't as well developed. Now, if you vaccinate them, there's a chance they're going to miss the vaccine site, the vaccination site. And typically, what you'll end up vaccinating is into the uric acid. So it's wasted. You're not going to get very good protection.
Mhm.
That's why, with if you talk to in ovo vaccination companies, they'll say do it at day 18 and a half to 19, because then even with a wider hatch window, you want to push it back as far as you can. So make sure you try and get it into the bird uh, rather than into the waste fluid.
I see. There's another question by Dr. Bernadette Ong is how to measure hatch window using meconium score.
Yeah, if you're gonna measure hatch window on based on how much the meconium, uh, then your hatch window is, or you're leaving the birds in there far too long.
Yes.
Doesn't mean to say your hatch window is wide. Just means that they've been in the machine too long, or you've been cooking the birds. So if the temperature's too high, you will see a lot of times they'll get diarrhea. So you'll see a much higher meconium score. So it's really difficult to do like that.
Okay. I have one question from Dr. Osama. I'm not sure where he's from. This probably I want to ask the same thing as well, because you did mention about the angle of the eggs or the tray.
Yep.
So how does the rotation move of the shelf affect the hatch window?
The actual the rotation doesn't, but what does affect it is the temperature. So you'll get one temperature in this position and one temperature in that position. So actually, if you look at pure eggshell temperature, staggered like this every hour, when you um, when you turn, that temperature is going to change, and that's why a lot of research is being done on higher turning rates early on. So the first 4 days, for example, and you can get a better result from that. And that's because you smooth out that pattern. Now, that's what's making the effect on the hatch window, or because you might have a slightly higher temperature or a lower temperature.
Mm-hmm.
And that turning, so if it's, for example, if it's not, so everybody will tell you 45 degrees to uh, 42 to 45 is the ideal. But if you reduce it, you need to increase the velocity. So you can still do it. You can reduce the angle, but you need a lot more airspeed across those eggs to keep a more uniform temperature. Otherwise, you'll see it start drifting apart.
I see. Uh, well, there's one question here, because there's probably one of the practice in Malaysia as well. When we collected the chickens, we scrub and clean the eggs. Does the process of scrubbing and cleaning the eggs affect the hatch windows?
It doesn't affect the hatch window, but it means that you're not managing your farms properly.
Yeah.
It's something. For example, when people say, "Can we wash the eggs?" Yes, I can say that it is physically possible to wash eggs, but if you're doing it, you're hiding something that's going wrong on your farm. So if you're scrubbing, and I have another presentation all on this, uh, but basically when you wipe an egg, so if it's got meconium on it and you wipe it, all you're going to do is push that dirt into the pores. So you're going to basically hide the problem that you have.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see that if you wash eggs routinely, if you start washing eggs, then all the farmers will do is, instead of taking more care over reduced floor eggs and better nest box hygiene, they'll just run the eggs through the washer more often. So whenever you're in those situations where you have to clean eggs, and if it's a lot of eggs, for example, you need to ask yourself why, and go back and fix that problem rather than manage it by cleaning them.
Okay, we have one question from South Africa, Dr. Francois Bo. He's saying is my chick yield at hatch is at 70%, and after processing, my chicks still stay on the floor for another 4 to 10 hours. Is the chick yield okay?
No,
Oh.
no, it's too high.
It's true.
Yeah, but yeah, if he wants to send me an email, we can probably look at why that is. Because there's a couple of factors that will affect it, and it's a lot to do with moisture loss, but also how long are they. But you need that good quality chick from your hatch. Now, a good quality chick might be smaller or less, but if all you're talking about with that, you've got more moisture in the bird, which is a much more unhealthy bird, to be honest. So we need a good quality bird. Then we need to make sure that we hold it in the right conditions. So basically that it's breathing through its nostrils and not through its mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can hold it for quite a while before you run into any kind of problem. Just make sure that those conditions are right.
Okay. Probably I ask a few more questions. Okay.
Yeah.
Because we have
Go ahead. I have plenty of time.
Yeah. Okay. We have another question from South Africa, Dr. Terence Taylor. If the average egg temperature is found to be around 103 Fahrenheit at 16 days of incubation, would a manual intervention by changing the step-down incubation temperature to get the eggshell back to 100 Fahrenheit be advised?
Yes, very much so. Yeah. You need to, at 103, you're going to start seeing mortality.
Yep.
So But if you're seeing 103 in one position, you got 104, 105 in another place in the machine. So bearing in mind that machines aren't all, exactly the same temperature. So if you're seeing 103, you've probably got a little bit more than that somewhere else, and you'll have a little bit less than that in other places. Now, once you get, once the eggs are producing heat, the cooler temperatures are going to have less effect. For example, you can go very low once you transfer them into the hatcher, and you're just, they'll take a bit longer to hatch, but you won't suffer on chick quality. But
Oh,
in terms of when you get to 103 and above, then you're really going to start causing those embryos problems.
I see. Okay, I have one question from Dr. Kiat Fu. Probably he's asking the question so that you can share with the audience. If I have an old
Sure.
machine, is it okay to run the hatch profile lower so that the high temperature issues is avoided, but the hatch time is delayed? Do you get the
Yes.
question?
Yeah. Yeah. I understand. Because they basically the older machines didn't have as much cooling in, but you can run them cooler. The issue is if they're going to allow you to run them cooler, if you know what I mean. If you put a modern breed into an old incubator, you might find it struggles to cool later on in incubation. So
Mm-hmm.
particularly day 15 to day 18.
Okay.
There's something else I didn't mention in the presentation, but a lot of the times people would level the eggs at day 15. And what you'll see now, the reason why we started leveling eggs at day 15 is because the machines were overheating.
Mm-hmm.
And we found if we level the eggs, that the overheating alarm would go away. We thought we fixed the problem, but in reality, what we did is increase the S speed across the temperature probe. Now that means that at the probe, it's a lower temperature, but because you're now not forcing the air through the eggs because you've leveled them, you'll get some eggs will be cooler than the ones at the end of the tray.
I see.
So that will also start to push that hatch window apart. So if you are leveling eggs at day 15 and then letting them sit level, that will also affect your hatch window.
I agree. Uh, okay. On There's one question from anonymous attendees. How often should we monitor the temperature and any suggestion on the amount of eggs per batch to be checked to ensure the hatch window is optimum?
Yeah, well, I would do, if you're going to go in, I would check several, probably about 12 eggs, but from all over the place. So you kind of need a random measure. And all you're going to do is go in there and put like a brawn thermometer on it
Mm-hmm.
and just see what the temperature you're getting from those. Now, obviously, make sure it's not an infertile because they normally run about a degree below. So you might think the temperature is ideal, but if it's an infertile egg, then it's not going to, it's not producing any heat.
Yeah, so it
So
must be
just
totally randomized from all over places.
yeah, take it as random as possible. Obviously, but what you don't want to do is start emptying the machine to go and measure it.
True.
So if you're in a situation where you can't get into the machine, then I'd put probes on and run the cables out to the front of the machine if possible. I mean, I would just do it on your youngest flocks, your oldest flocks, and the middle ones, just to get a sort of base rate and see how your machines are looking. So if you've got 100-degree eggshell temperature on that, see what your air temperature is reading on the younger flocks and the older flocks. And that will give you a good idea of where you need to set your profiles.
Okay. Probably I'll ask two more questions. Okay, for you, if it's okay.
Yeah, sure.
There's one question is how well does spikes work on hatch window?
Spidey's works excellent on the hatch window because if you remember, I explained about the egg age. So you get cellular mortality going on the longer you store those eggs for. Now, with Spideys, you replicate those cells again. So the cells are replaced. So basically, instead of those eggs as they get older sort of coming down, it pushes them back up.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you put a 9-day-old eggs in with 3-day-old eggs, because you've done a Spidey's treatment on the older eggs, you don't need to give any extra incubation time. So that hatch window will come much closer together.
Okay. I'll probably ask the last question for you then. Did you recommend to pull out the chicks after 24 hours of peak humidity in the hatcher?
No, the optimum place for a chick holding is in the hatcher. That's what it's designed to do.
Mm-hmm.
So until you're ready to process those birds, leave them in the hatcher as long as possible. A lot of the times, people will pull all of those out on hatch day and leave them standing in a room. But if they're in a hatcher basket, you need a lot of airflow going through those baskets to be effective for cooling.
Mm-hmm.
So leave them in the hatcher until you're ready to process them.
I see. Okay, we have quite a number of questions. I probably cannot ask all the questions, so I think that's the last question for today's webinar. For any other question, maybe if for those that gave wrote your name on the question, we will probably can try to answer it via emails when we send out the e-certificates. Okay. With that, I would like to really thank you, Mr. Jason, for your very useful and uh, a good presentation and talk today. Okay, we hope to
My
see you
pleasure.
again in the future webinar. I need to learn a lot more on hatchery management and other stuff. Okay, especially on hatchery management. With that, again, we'd like to thank you from all of us, WVPA Malaysia, as well as Livestock Malaysia for your presence today. And from all the audience today, we benefit a lot from today. And I would like to pass our session again back to the MC or moderator, MC of the session.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nick, and to our speaker for the wonderful session. And also thank you for everyone who's tuning in to this webinar. Hope you enjoyed today's session. We would like to invite you to join our community, follow us on our social media. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you again next time. Thank you. Stay safe, everyone.